Well, I've been talking about this for quite some time, but this week we are gonna get started. So this week we are doing block number 1 of the 2022 Treasure Heart Creations Christmas Quilt A Long. Let's get started. So for block number 1, we will be making a Sawtooth Star. Now this is one of those quilt blocks where there's probably a million different ways to construct it. And well, you get different looks just by changing up the fabrics or using various techniques. What I like about this block is you can basically put it in any quilt top and, well, just make it work. So in this video, I'll first take a look at how the center can influence the overall look of the block. Then we'll take a look at the different methods of creating the flying geese units to make the star legs. I'll share some of my thoughts on the advantages and disadvantages of each method. But also, as a reminder, I will be making 2 different quilt tops. In one version, I will incorporate this Christmas panel by Robert Kaufman and probably use it in the center of the quilt top, then border it with all the blocks we will be constructing. For the other version, I will be using a charm pack called Vintage Holiday by Bonnie and Camille from Moda. I do have 2 of these charm packs and will probably use most of the fabrics in addition to yards of a background fabric. So in using these pre-cuts, I can share my thoughts on which methods are pre-cut friendly and which are better suited for using yardage. Then you will decide which method you want to do. So with that in mind, let's get started. So let's talk about that center square for a little bit. Now, no matter what construction method you choose to do in order to make these star legs here, that center or this center square here is always going to be a 4.5-inch block that you need when you cut your fabrics. So the finished size of the center square, of course, is going to be 4 inches. Now you can choose to do one solid fabric like how I did here. And in looking at the charm pack, I did notice that there are some prints that, well, they would make a very beautiful center star or center square for the star. So I chose to actually do this one as well as do this one. And there's another print which I can't find right now. This is probably the quickest method to do because you're not really piecing anything. You're just cutting out one solid 4.5-inch square here. Now you could also choose to fussy cut a piece of the fabric out. I did find this in my stash in which there is a lot of black, but I wanted to actually cut this silver flower out here. What I ended up doing was cutting a 4.5-inch square just to capture that flower or the poinsettia. So I actually got 2 of them here. So if you do have a printed or yards of a print fabric such as this, and you want to just grab or fussy cut a piece of it out, just make sure that your motif is actually bigger than 4.5 inches here. The other idea or the other thing that you can do is if you have a 4-patch. Now, these were 2.5-inch squares, and when you sew them together, it'll make a 4.5-inch square here. So I might use these 4 patches in this block. I might use it in the future in a future block. So I just decided to make a few of them. So be creative. You could do another block that's a totally different quilt block if you wanted to. So these are just a few examples of what you can do for the center of your star. You can do a 4-patch, you can just fussy cut a motif from a fabric, or in the example quilt, I actually constructed a pinwheel. As long as whatever you use is 4.5 inches, hey, go ahead and use it for your block. Or make up your own thing. It's your quilt, you do it how you want to do it. So let's take a look at the various methods in which we can construct our star legs or flying geese units. Now this first method I'm going to call the HST method. That's because you're going to construct your flying geese using a whole bunch of half square triangles. So to make one block using this HST method, here's what you're going to need. You're going to need your center square, in which for this block, I'm going to use this 4.5 inch 4-patch that I constructed using 2.5 inch squares. Then you will need 8 of your 2.5 inch squares of a print, then 12 2.5 inch squares of a background. Now this method is very, very pre-cut friendly. Whether you're using a charm square, whether you're using a jelly roll, I mean, basically the basis of each of these fabric squares is a 2.5 inch square. So again, very, very pre-cut friendly. Let's see how we make this half square triangle method of flying geese units. You will be making 8 half square triangles for one block. To make the half square triangles, take 8 of the background 2.5 inch squares and draw a line diagonally from corner to corner on the wrong side of the fabric. Then, line it up right sides together with a print square. Sew on the line, not a 1/4 inch away on either side. Then, cut a 1/4 inch away from that center seam. Press your seam allowances to one side, or if you prefer, press them open. Before sewing everything together, I like to lay out the block. Now be sure that when you lay out the half square triangles, you point them in the correct orientation with the background forming a triangle that points inward toward the center. Sew the half square triangles together to make the flying geese units. Then you can start sewing the units into rows. Then sew the rows together. Again, you can press your seam allowances open or press them to one side, whichever you prefer. So here's the block using the HST or half square triangle method of creating flying geese. Now what I like about this method is, number one, it's very pre-cut friendly. On any pre-cut, you can cut it down to 2.5 inch squares fairly simply. And as you saw, you just make your half square triangles using those 2.5 inch squares. What I also like about this method is it's very, very easy to scrap up this particular block. I mean, you don't have to use the same fabric within the block. You can easily incorporate different fabrics. Now, what I don't like about this method is the fact that, well, each unit has to be constructed individually. So I had to make 8 half square triangles. Now you multiply that by 5 blocks, you're looking at a total of 40 half square triangles to make. Your fabric requirements, if you choose to do all 5 blocks using this particular method, well, it took 12 2.5 inch squares of the background. Multiply that by 5, you got 70 2.5 inch squares to cut. So that's something to consider when choosing this method over some of the other methods. There's a lot of waste. I mean, what I got here is all the cutaways from creating the half square triangles. Now, you can trash this, or if you are a little bit more creative, you can sew them together and create some smaller half square triangles. Now, in the example quilt, all of the cutaways, well, I saved them and I used them to actually create the cornerstones of that quilt top. So with all these cutaways, you can save them, create smaller half square triangles, and I don't know, use it in the quilt top in some creative way, or just trash it. Hey, the choice is yours. You do what you want to do with them. Now, the second method that I would like to show or demonstrate is what I call the Snowball Method. Now, instead of using half square triangles, we're going to be using a 2.5 by 4.5 inch rectangle. So Let's take a look at that method. So using the snowball method, you're going to need 4 2.5-inch by 4.5-inch rectangles of a background fabric. You're also going to need 4 2.5-inch squares of the same background fabric. And again, these 4 squares are going to become the corners of your block. Now you're going to need a 4.5-inch square for the center. Now this time, I'm actually just going to use one of the print squares, but you can use the 4-patch, you can use the pinwheel. Again, the center part is your choice, as long as it's 4.5 inches. Then you're going to need 8 2.5-inch squares of a print. Now here I have 4 of this print, and I chose 4 of this print. Should you choose to, you could do just 2 prints, 4 of each, or you could make all 8 of these squares, all different prints. Again, the choice is yours, and that's what the flexibility of this method can do for you. To make the flying geese units using this snowball method, first take 8 of the 2.5-inch print squares and draw a line diagonally from corner to corner on the wrong side of the fabrics. You could also iron or finger press that line. Then line up the 2.5-inch square right side together with the 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangle. Be sure that you orient the 2.5-inch square so that the diagonal line is going from the bottom corner to the middle of the top edge of the rectangle. Then sew on the line. Don't make that mistake of sewing a 1/4 inch away from the line. Trim off the corner, but make sure you're cutting about a 1/4 inch away from the seam you just sewn. Then repeat the process with the other corner. Lay out the block and make sure that the flying geese units are pointing inward toward the center of the block. Then sew your units together into rows and sew your rows together. Press your seam allowances to one side or open, whichever you prefer. So here is the block using the snowball method. Now from the looks of it, it looks very similar to the half square triangle method. And just like the half square triangle method, the reasons why I like this method is, again, number 1, very pre-cut friendly. Number 2, you can easily scrap it up just by swapping out fabrics. One other reason I like this method over the half square triangle method is you're not constructing individual units. Because we use this 2.5 by 4.5-inch rectangle to construct the flying geese, well, we don't have 48 billion half square triangles to make, which makes it a little bit faster to construct it. But the snowball method is not really my favorite method. In reality, my favorite method of constructing flying geese units is actually the 4 at a time, or sometimes called the 4 at a time no waste method, in which that's the method we're going to do next. So this method is actually my favorite technique or method of making flying geese units, because you don't just get one flying geese unit, you get 4 of them. And most of the time you need multiple flying geese units. So this is the method I choose to make flying geese units. So here's what you're going to need for this method. You'll still need a square of 4.5 inches for the center. Now, of course, this could be a solid print like this, where I fussy cut it off of a fabric. You could do a smaller constructed block. The choice is yours. So here I got 4 3-inch squares. Now, I'm just choosing to use one print color. You can use 4 different print colors, or you can just use 2 different print colors. That choice will be yours. Now these 3-inch squares, they are going to become your star legs. Here I have one 5 1/4 inch square. Now this will become the body, or that center triangle in the flying geese unit. Whoops, I forgot to mention something. You're also going to need 4 2.5-inch squares. Now these squares are going to be the corners of your block. So whatever fabric you choose to cut that 5 1/4-inch square from, well, you might want to cut 4 additional 2.5-inch squares. This method will look very awkward at first, but trust me, it works. First, take your 3-inch squares and mark a diagonal line from corner to corner on the back of the fabric, just like how you would when making half-square triangles. Then, take 2 of those 3-inch squares and place them right sides together with the 5 1/4-inch square. Orient the 3-inch squares so that the diagonal line you drew looks like one continuous line with a bit of an overlap in the center. Use pins to hold the pieces in place if needed. This time, you will sew 1/4 inch away from that center line on both sides of the line. Then cut diagonally on the drawn line. Press the seam allowances toward the 2 smaller triangles. Now you must press the seam allowances before doing the next step. Otherwise, well, let me just say that you better have Jack handy. Think of the unit as a heart made of triangles. With the point or bottom of the heart pointed toward you, take another 3-inch square and line it up right sides together. Orient the 3-inch square so that the drawn diagonal line goes from the bottom point of that heart shape and runs towards the center where the 2 triangles meet. Sew again 1/4 inch away from that center line on both sides of the line. Then cut on the diagonal line and repeat with the other heart shape. You should have 4 flying geese units. Trim each unit down to 2.5 by 4.5 inches. Lay out the block and make sure that the flying geese units are pointing inward toward the center of the block. Then sew your units together into rows. Then sew your rows together and press your seam allowances to one side or open, whichever you prefer. Here's our block using the 4 at a time flying geese method. And personally, this is my favorite method because, well, you don't have as many individual parts to sew together, unlike the snowball method or the half-square triangle method. And again, you get 4 flying geese units in one shot. There are some drawbacks to using this particular method, and the big one is, well, you can't really use pre-cuts efficiently for this method. Remember that I started with a 5 1/4 inch background for the center triangle here. 5 1/4, yeah, you can't use a charm pack for that. You can cut a 3-inch square from a charm or a 5-inch square, but I don't know if that's the most effective use of a charm pack. So I typically don't use a pre-cut or at least a charm pack to make this or to do this technique of flying geese method. The other thing that I don't like about this method is you don't get a ton of variety. Or do you? I was actually experimenting with this method, and I may have found a way to actually introduce a lot of different fabrics into this, especially with the star legs. So let's take a look at that. Now this scrappy version of the 4 at a time flying geese method is very similar to what you just did. But instead of drawing our diagonal line on the 3-inch squares, we're going to draw it on the right side of the 5 1/4 inch square. With the 3-inch squares, we're going to cut those squares in half diagonally. Line up the triangles right sides together with the 5 1/4 inch square. Make sure you orient the triangle so that the diagonal edge lines up with the diagonal line you drew on the bigger square, and that you are placing the triangle in one of the corners of that square. Do the same to the opposite corner, making sure that the triangle is on the same side of that drawn diagonal line. sew 1/4 inch away from the center diagonal. Then repeat the steps on the other side of that diagonal line. Cut the unit in half diagonally and press the seam allowances towards the smaller triangles. You will again get that triangle heart shape. Now take another triangle piece and place it so that the shorter edge lines up with the edge of the bigger piece towards the bottom corner, or in other words, towards the bottom of that heart shape. Again, sew 1/4 inch away from the center, then repeat the steps for the other side. Cut in half, and this should give you 2 of the flying geese units. You can repeat the process with the other heart shape. Now press, trim, and you got 4 scrappy looking flying geese units. So in preparation for today's video, I kind of got to thinking about precuts. At one point in time in my quilting journey, I was actually crazy about jelly roll strips. Yeah, I had so many jelly rolls that I probably should have gone to Jelly Rolls Anonymous. Over the years though, as I got more and more experienced with quilting, I sort of found that while there are certain advantages to using precuts, there's also a certain amount of disadvantages in using a precut. So I was just thinking about what are those advantages and disadvantages? Well, for one, the one thing that I do like about precuts is the fact that on a lot of things like jelly rolls, charm packs, or layer cakes, you get one piece of fabric throughout the entire line, maybe 1 or 2. And so I like the variety that you can get out of a precut. I also like the fact that, well, if a pattern uses a precut size, for example, 5-inch squares, well, guess what? That saves me time in cutting all of that fabric. There's a few things that over the years I've learned that I don't like about precuts, because sometimes you want to do a particular quilt and using a particular fabric that is part of a precut, but sometimes, well, maybe that pattern, it doesn't lend itself to being a precut friendly pattern. So you end up wasting a lot of fabric. Case in point, this 4 at a time flying geese method. Yep. Not very precut friendly because you're going to be wasting a lot of it, number one. And number two, well, you can't get a 5 1/4 inch square out of a 5-inch square. You can get it out of a 10-inch square, yeah, but using a 5-inch square, nope, not going to happen. I do notice, though, that sometimes when you buy a precut, it is at a premium price. If you do the math, you'll figure out that sometimes a precut is actually a little bit more than just buying yardage. But then again, if you think about it, the variety that you get out of a precut and the amount of yards you would have to buy to get all of that variety, it might be worth it, actually. A lot of times I'll just go back and forth. Do I want the precut? Do I want to buy yardage? Most of the time I just buy precuts. But of course, these days though, Missouri Star Quilt Company, they built their whole company and their whole business based on a precut. So they're my go-to in terms of finding patterns that will use a precut. And then of course, any experienced quilter will know that if you want to use a precut on a pattern, you can do it. It's going to take some effort because you might have to redo the math, but it's possible. How do you guys feel about precuts? I think I may have asked this question if you've been following the Treasure Heart Creations 52 Weeks, 52 Block series, but since then, a lot of you have been subscribing to the channel that are new. So let's pose that question again. Do you like to use precuts or do you prefer to use yards of fabric? I use both. I like precuts, but I also do like to cut up yardage when necessary. And a lot of times I will cut yardage into pre-cut sizes. So I don't know. I'm on the fence with, are pre-cuts good or are pre-cuts bad? I'm on the fence with that. But where are you on this spectrum? Do you hate them with a passion, or do you love them like there's no tomorrow? No, that's not good. Do you hate them with a passion, or do you love them like a sexy Latin lover? Yeah, that might get striked by YouTube. Let us all know. Put a comment down below. Let us know what you think about pre-cuts. So let me do a recap of all the blocks that I have thus far. Here are the blocks that I'll be putting with the panel version of the quilt top. And here are the blocks that I created using the charm pack. Remember that you will be making 5 blocks of each design, and you choose the method that you want to follow. And don't forget that the 4.5 inch square for the center, well, make it unique and representative of you. If you want to get a head start for the next block, you may want to cut a few 2.5 inch strips of prints and backgrounds, and maybe make a few more flying geese units, because the next block we tackle will be the wreath. Well, until next time, go out and create something.